Hello guys. In today's video, we'll be looking at Philip Melanchthon's arguments against the Papacy, which are found in his treatise on the power and the primacy of the Pope, which is in the Book of Concord. Just to consider that the Reformers didn't have the Vatican I and Vatican II artillery that we have to use today, but they're still working with biblical texts and they're responding to papal texts like Unum Sanctum and Dictatus Papae, which share similar principles that are found in Vatican I. A clarification. I want to recommend everybody to read his treatise. It's like only 12 pages and you can find it online. This will be a video displaying only some of his arguments, so if you want to read his full text and not necessarily our abridged summary, we highly recommend that you go check it out. My brother and I read it in about 2 days, but that was alongside taking notes and watching debates like the Ubi Petrus and Eric Ibarra debate, and then other videos as well. So with that all being said, let's go into what the three papal claims are. 1. The Roman Pontiff claims that he is supreme above all bishops and pastors by divine right. 2. By divine right, he has the authority to enthrone and depose kings and regulate secular dominions and such. And 3. He says it's necessary for salvation to believe this and to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. So these are the points that he will be critiquing, and let's continue on to the testimonies of Scripture that are cited. The first passage Melanchthon uses is Luke 22 verses 24 through 27. Now, there is also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors, but not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table, or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. Melanchthon, when looking at this passage, takes a principle that Jesus teaches. He says, when Christ spoke of his passion, the apostles were disputing over who should be the head of the others, and, as it were, the vicar of the absent Christ. Christ rebukes this error of the apostles and teaches that there shall not be lordship or superiority among them. Instead, the apostles would be sent forth as equals to the common ministry of the gospel. So what Melanchthon is drawing from this text here is that Christ bans all forms of lordship among the apostles. He talks about how the kings of the Gentiles exercise a lordship, but then says, not so among you. But on the other hand, Jesus says, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and so on and so forth. So this is showing that one disciple is not permitted lordship over the rest, like the papists would contend for Peter. Another point to this is that Jesus uses a king as an example, and what he describes sounds very similar to the second claim made by the Pope, that is, the temporal power over kings and rulers. The next verses are John 20:21 through 23. It says, so Jesus said to them again, peace to you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you. And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. If ye forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them, and if ye retain the sins of any, they are retained. Melanchthon then says, Christ sends forth his disciples in equality, without any distinction. He says, as the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. He says that he sends them individually in the same way he himself was sent. Therefore he grants no one a privilege or lordship above the rest. So Christ was sent individually by the Father, and so likewise the apostles are sent individually, none with lordship or privilege over the others. The next passage comes from Galatians chapter 2. Paul says, but from those who seemed to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows personal favoritism to no man. For those who seemed to be something added nothing to me. Melanchthon takes notice that Paul did not seek ordination or confirmation from Peter to preach the gospel, despite Paul even meeting with Peter. But instead, Paul says regarding John, Peter, and James that even though they seemed influential, what they were made no difference to him and added nothing to him. And so, the gospel and ministry that Paul had depended entirely on Christ and his word. He did not appeal to the authority of Peter. Continuing after verse 6, Paul says in Galatians verses 7 through 10, but on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter, For he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand to fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I also was eager to do. Melanchthon just reasserts what he said earlier. He adds the conclusion that Paul should have acknowledged Peter as a superior if he had the papal authority. But on the contrary, Paul seems to set Peter equal to James and John. They are all pillars, and Peter is not just one pillar above the rest. And also, I'm willing to grant that Peter had a special role, being the representative of the other apostles, and the mouthpiece of them, but Vatican I condemns this view, and it basically says that Peter did not only just have a role of honor. Being a representative of the other apostles does not equate to Vatican I papal supremacy, universal jurisdiction, and infallibility. And so I'm also willing to grant a sort of primacy for the Bishop of Rome, that he was the first among equals, and as Irenaeus says, that the Church in Rome has preeminent authority. But it only has preeminent authority because it was doubly founded by Apostles Peter and Paul. Also, Melanchthon gives more scriptural counter-arguments in his full treatise, but for the sake of time we will not go over them, so if you want to read them, then you can just read them for yourself. So now we will get into the testimony of history, where Melanchthon now shifts his argumentation towards history and begins by mentioning the Council of Nicaea, and he refers to the sixth canon. It says, "Let the ancient customs in Egypt, Libya, and Pentapolis prevail, that the Bishop of Alexandria have jurisdiction in all these, since the like is customary for the Bishop of Rome also." Melanchthon says, if the Roman bishop already had the superiority by divine law, it would not have been lawful for the council to take away any right from him and transfer it to the Bishop of Alexandria. No, all the bishops of the East should have always sought ordination and confirmation from the Bishop of Rome. So his point here is that if the Bishop of Rome had universal jurisdiction at the time of Nicaea, then it was wrong for the councils to give this jurisdiction to the East and take it away from Rome. And he also mentions that if this supremacy were true, the bishops in the East should have always sought to be confirmed by the Bishop of Rome alone. And then he discusses this further with a quote from St. Cyprian. St. Cyprian says, "So as for the divine observance and apostolic practice, to celebrate ordination properly, whatever bishops of the same province live nearby should come together with the people for whom a pastor is being appointed." So Melanchthon's purpose of referencing this letter from Cyprian is that Cyprian references within his quote to the fourth canon of the Council of Nicaea, where they permit the bishop from surrounding provinces to come and lay hands on the one being confirmed. And so there's no mention of the Bishop of Rome having this authority only. It is also worth noticing that Cyprian states that it's a divine and apostolic practice, and Melanchthon also grasps this as well. Melanchthon says, "In the greater part of the world, in the Latin and Greek churches, neither ordination nor confirmation was sought from a bishop of Rome. Therefore, it is clear enough that the churches did not then grant superiority and domination to the Bishop of Rome." So Melanchthon is showing that this power was not solely the Bishop of Rome's, but also of other bishops. Melanchthon then continues and mentions the well-known fact about the Bishop of Rome that he was not present at the Council of Nicaea, and then he gives a quote from Jerome saying, "If there is a question about authority, the world is greater than the city. Wherever there has been a bishop, whether at Rome, or Eubugium, or Constantinople, or Rhegium, or Alexandria, he has the same dignity and priesthood." After this quote, Melanchthon responds and says, "Many ancient councils have been proclaimed and held in which the Bishop of Rome did not preside, such as that of Nicaea and most others. And this too testifies that the Church did not then acknowledge the primacy or superiority of the Bishop of Rome." So he's taking note that there is an equality in dignity and priesthood of all of these cities, and a surprising absence of the universal bishop at the Council of Nicaea. The next piece of historical evidence that Melanchthon gives is a testimony from Saint Gregory the Great, who even being Pope said, "Now I confidently say that whosoever calls himself or desires to be called universal bishop is in his elation the precursor of the Antichrist, because he proudly puts himself above all others," or precursor of Antichrist. So even though he's writing to a patriarch, It is clear by reason that he did not permit the title to even be used because of the pride that it brings. Melanchthon comments on this passage and says, Pope Gregory, writing to the Patriarch at Alexandria, forbids that he be called universal bishop. In the records he says that in the Council of Chalcedon, the primary was offered to the Bishop of Rome, but it was not even accepted. And so it's clear from Melanchthon that this citation from Gregory the Great is in direct contradiction to papal teaching and to the 3 points which reflect the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. Melanchthon makes another argument from history, but for the sake of time we have to skip it and move on. So the final area of Melanchthon's treatise which we're going to be covering is the refutation of Roman arguments. Melanchthon does not give an exhaustive list before refuting certain arguments, so we will touch upon interpretations of certain passages that Melanchthon gives, and then we'll give Melanchthon's refutations. So the first Catholic argument is, only St. Peter was given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and all other apostles were only given the power of binding and loosing. Sorry for the large text wall, but here's Melanchthon's interpretation of what Matthew 16 means. He says, in all these passages, Peter is the representative of the entire assembly of apostles, as appears from the text itself. Christ does not ask Peter alone when he says, who do you say that I am? What is said here to Peter alone in the singular, I'll give you the keys and whatever you bind, is elsewhere expressed in the plural, whatever you, plural, bind, and if you, plural, forgive the sins of anyone. And so these words show that the keys are given to all the apostles alike, and that all the apostles are sent forth alike. Therefore, these passages demonstrate that Peter is the representative of the entire assembly of the apostles. They do not grant Peter any privilege or superiority or lordship. Thus, Melanchthon shows that what the keys signify is the power to bind and loose. The power to bind and loose, aka the keys, are given to all the apostles 2 chapters later. The exact same power is given to everyone, so that there is nothing unique about Peter, besides the power being given to him first because he was the first one to answer. I find Melanchthon's interpretation much more plausible. The second Roman Catholic argument touches on the idea that in Matthew 16, Jesus founds the papacy on Peter, who is the rock on which the church is built. It says St. Peter is the rock on which the church is built in Matthew 16. Melanchthon says, as for the declaration, on this rock I will build my church, certainly the church has not been built upon the authority of a man. Rather, it has been built upon the ministry of the confession Peter made, in which he proclaims that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Therefore, Christ addresses Peter as a minister on this rock, that is, this ministry. So then Melanchthon backs up his interpretation by appealing to church fathers that have also interpreted it in the same way that he has. He writes, most of the Holy Church Fathers, such as Origen, Cyprian, Augustine, Hilary, and Bede, interpret the passage on this rock in this way, as not referring to the person of Peter. Chrysostom says, upon this rock, not upon Peter, for he built his church not upon man, but upon the faith of Peter. But what was his faith? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Hilary says, the Father revealed to Peter that he should say, you are the Son of the living God. Therefore, the building of the church is upon this rock of confession. This faith is the foundation of the church. So, I've looked through my copy of the Catena Aurea by Thomas, and from what I've read, the only people in it that have interpreted the rock as Peter are Rabanus Maurus and Jerome. And so I'm not trying to say that there's not more out there that might have interpreted Peter as the rock, but I'm just saying that from what I've researched and from what I found in the Catena Aurea, is just these two. And of course, I guess you could argue that Theophylact might have held that Peter was the rock. And then here are the theologians that I found in the Catena Aurea that do not interpret Matthew 16:18 as Peter being the rock. And these people are also cited as being witnesses to Melanchthon's interpretation by Melanchthon. And so I understand that Catholics might argue that his confession and himself are not mutually exclusive, but that it could be both. But to that I would just say that the fathers still say that the rock is either Christ or Peter's confession. They don't say that the rock is Peter. The next Roman Catholic argument is Jesus tells Peter to feed my lambs, therefore he has superiority. Melanchthon responds and says, as for what is said in John 21:15-19, feed my lambs, and do you love me more than these? It does not follow from this passage that a peculiar superiority was given to Peter. Christ tells him, feed, i.e., teach the word or rule the church with the word. and this task Peter has in common with the other apostles. So to conclude, Melanchthon's treatise on the power and the primacy of the Pope does not end right here. He proceeds to go through 3 more points of argumentation, and he goes through the comparison between Christ and the Pope. He shows that the marks of the Antichrist are very similar to the Pope, and then he goes through the power and jurisdiction of bishops throughout history. So we cannot go in length here, but just to let you know, that's what Melanchthon says. And just to add this at the very end, I'm not going to go into this. I might go into it more in my video on why I didn't become Roman Catholic, but if any Catholics watch this video, I just want to ask them if they agree with this syllogism. Obviously, they won't agree with the conclusion, but I just want to understand if it's a valid syllogism or if any of the premises are faulty, because I'm trying to refine it a little bit from this is what I've kind of come up with. So yeah, I'd appreciate that if any, or just any knowledgeable Christians of any denomination, but since it's kind of targeted towards Catholics, I'd like to hear what they have to say about it. And stay tuned because that Roman Catholic video is coming up soon. See ya.